recording of this session, and this will be made available via the ACEN website after today's webinar. So we do have a lot of focus now more than ever on job-ready graduates and WIL. So let's listen and engage with the team's framework as an approach to assure quality in WIL. And I think given the number of registrations today and people that are still coming into the session, I know that it's something that we are all interested in. We are also very interested today in finding out where you're from. So please utilise the chat functionality, which is to the bottom right-hand side of your screen. You will see the purple menu option where you can open the panel and use the chat function, which is the speech bubble there. And we would love to know where everyone is from. So please let us know that. In this same area, in the chat function, please put any questions you have throughout the presentation. The project team will endeavour to answer those as we go. And we will also have some small breakout sessions towards the end of the presentation today. All right, so I think that's just about it from me. Over to you, Matthew.
Yeah, thanks, Erin, and good morning, everybody. Our plan is to try and keep to a very tight schedule with our presentation today and to try and complete this within the hour. And one of the things that we want to try and work towards is a bit of a discussion group towards the end. So first, before I begin, it would be remiss of me not to acknowledge the members of our project team that are coming together today. We have an apology, unfortunately, from Professor Lindy McAllister, who was at the birth of this project at a random phone conversation I had with her a couple of years ago. But we're joined by Leonie Russell, who was also a project lead and early on in that, Dr. Ricky Tunney from QT, Lorraine Smith from Sydney, and Dr. Kate Thompson from Sydney as well. So I want to acknowledge those, and each of us will be presenting today as we go throughout the session. What we want to try and do today, that's it. So I was just looking for my next slide function now. I've got it. All right. What we want to try and do today is begin by giving a bit of an overview of the project. And our project really started to examine the question of how would you assure the quality of work integrated learning at an institutional level. And we want to provide a bit of an overview of that. In doing so, mapping out the current landscape around the conversations of quality and work integrated learning and how those two intersect. From there, we will share a little bit of our experience of the benchmarking that we undertook as part of the project and utilising the framework to benchmark some of our practice and to test the framework in practice. And then from there, we'll share some of the experiences that people have actually had recently in employing the framework in action. And then to conclude with, we're going to pose to you a couple of questions around utilising the framework in your settings and context, and we'll break into small groups to share some of our thoughts on that. So I'm going to move relatively quickly through this first part around giving the project outline. In an email you sent previously, you should have had a copy of the framework shared with you. But if you want more information about the project, there is a website where contained on that website is the framework itself in detail, as well as a project report and a few other things. And that website will be updated throughout over the next little while as we collect more and more information. As we say to everybody, if you use the framework, it would be great for us to capture its use in different ways. So if you do get online and use the framework, please feel free to share back to us so that we can sort of keep a record of what's going on. So where the project came from was a goal that we had to undertake a bit of a review of where quality was with regards to WIL across Australian universities. And from that, we wanted to develop some benchmarks and frameworks around what quality assurance would look like in this space. And in particular, we were looking at it from an institutional-wide perspective. And by institution, we defined it sort of at various levels. You could understand the institution as the university as a whole, but we also looked at the institution as a faculty grouping. And quite often when we look at faculties, particularly in Australian universities, they're the size of the universities overseas, but then also within schools and bounded spaces. So institution, look at it at different levels depending upon the boundaries of which your practice exists. And the way we undertook the project was the first phase was a bit of a review, both a literature review, but we also interviewed 17 key staff across Australia at various levels, from the Vice-Chancellors all the way through to people working on the grounds at the coalface of will practice, to get their understandings of quality, but also to understand what was currently occurring in the sector. From that, we then conducted several workshops with about 120 participants across the workshops that looked at the proposed ideas of frameworks and standards that were emerging from the interviews that we'd done. And those workshops were iterative. So each workshop we went to, we had a slightly different framework that had been modified based on the previous feedback, until eventually we got to a point where we had a level of confidence in what was actually being put forward. From there, we then undertook a benchmarking exercise where we benchmarked within a faculty grouping, and Kate and Ricky will talk about that, where they were talking about health faculty groupings. And we also looked at benchmarking from an institution or a university's perspective, where Lorraine, Leonie and myself compared QUT, RMIT and the University of Sydney at that level. And so those benchmarking, we were looking at the usability of the framework and whether or not it actually made sense in practice. Where the challenge for us really sits is trying to understand what we mean by will. It wasn't the intent of the project, and nor will be my intent today to go through a lengthy exploration of the definitions of will. We can do that at another time. But will is a really interesting contested term that I think has sometimes been defined really simplistically and at other times really complicatedly. And somehow we know what it is, but we don't quite know how to define it. And McRae and Johnston really put that challenge out there, and that they highlighted the fact that you can't go around assuring quality of something if you actually don't understand the parameters and the attributes of that thing that you're actually talking about. They proposed a little bit of an idea as to what we're doing, and what we've hoped the framework does is not only does it push towards this notion of quality assurance, but it actually starts to provide a little bit of a framework around what will is. What does practice within work integrated learning look like? And to that extent, when we started doing some homework on that, we mapped out across the institutions the variety of definitions for work integrated learning. Here's just a selection where we look at really clear definitions of will, say at QUT, which is my institution, where we talk about it as having 4 elements: curriculum, assessment, meaningful work, and direct engagement with industry, as opposed to where you start seeing it explored in other spaces, where you start seeing integrations with problem-based learning, authentic learning, and a blurring of those boundaries around those activities. So will is, as I said, quite a contested space. So coming from that, what we actually got to was a theoretical framing that underpinned the activity that we were doing, which sort of said that will is a complex interconnection of a variety of elements, which is almost self-evident. But its core around outcomes and relationships, which I think is really important to what differentiate it from other pedagogical approaches in higher education. And in that sense, will, therefore, for us, were experiences of work within curriculum. And by work, we mean that real engagement with real practice, and separating out what we're talking about from broader concepts of authentic learning. And particularly, we're talking about partnership and engagement, and obviously the assessment, so the curriculum aspect of what's there. So when we looked at the concept of quality, though, and interrogated this, what we found is that quality, and this isn't a new space, so it goes back into the 90s, where you can find conversations around quality in higher education, quality work experience, etc. But essentially, though, it looked at assuring quality across 3 sort of spaces, and that was the before, the during, and the after of activity, or the presage, the process, and the product. And so in that space, it was quite interesting because you get an overlap with some of the work that Billett's done around work integrated learning in particular, where he starts to talk about the importance of us looking at the before, the during, and the after of the work integrated learning experience. And so if we look at work integrated learning as a partnership, as a real work experience, if we layer over that the question of quality assurance, then we need to be examining quality at those 3 phases of that student experience, and not just measuring outcomes, but we also need to be looking at the inputs that go into what constitutes high quality high quality student experiences. So from there, when we started to explore this a bit more depth, we came across obviously the work out of Sachs, Rowe and Wilson, which was the good good practice guide around work integrated learning. We'll have the 4 interconnected elements of WIL. They talk about learning outcomes, the context, the resources, the stakeholder relationships, etc. We also uncovered some work by McRae from Canada, where they put forward their PAIR model, or pedagogy, experience, assessment, and reflection as key elements. Now, the critique that I'd have of this model is it's very much focused around just the curriculum element of the activity. They don't tend to then venture into some of the institutional wraparounds of work integrated learning. And as most of us would know, work integrated learning as a practice isn't just a curriculum or pedagogic practice. It also overlaps quite considerably with governance and administration and oversight and risk management. So there's these elements that I don't think McRae quite got to in that space. And then obviously Teresa Winchester-Cedo's put out some dimensions around quality of will recently, and she came to 9 dimensions and sort of went that whole breadth across what was there. Once again though, whilst there's a little bit of consideration of some of those institutional elements, the activity around quality and will has largely been focused around that curriculum space. So where we started to get to, what emerged for us, were really 4 key dimensions that we framed our framework around, and that was the student experience. In other words, what's the student doing in the workplace and the quality of that experience, both from what they do in practice, but also the learning and the engagement with the university. Curriculum design, and this goes to that question around the input of what we're there. The quality of the curriculum design, the connection of the assessment to the learning outcomes, all of those considerations. And so far, those 2 spaces have been rather well researched. The other 2 spaces that we put forward is that we actually think there are 2 other dimensions that need to be considered, and that's firstly the institutional requirements. And for us, this is around strategy, policy, risk management, legal governance, etc. in that space there. And the 4th one is around stakeholder engagement. That's the quality of the partnerships. And we deliberately use the word stakeholder here and not industry or community, because we believe stakeholders in this instance are our industry partners, our community partners, but also government, regulators, and other oversight bodies, professional accreditations, etc. Quite often, and there was an interesting critique offered by Andrew Stewart in a workshop a little while back. He said it's really interesting when you start looking at the legal frameworks around will. People have a fairly good understanding around risk management, they have a pretty good understanding around duty of care, but they have a very loose understanding of the requirements of the higher education standards and how that impacts upon what we do within work integrated learning. So for us, stakeholder engagement is far bigger than just working with industry. And so we've then created this framework. Nice tiny letters for you, because it's always good to have a PowerPoint slide with too many words. But if you jump onto the website, you'll be able to pull out this. This is the overview and presents the various standards that we had. And from there, our model of our framework was to say that we've got these 4 domains of practice. We then mapped out a series of standards of practice that sat under those, and for each of those standards of practice, we went out and collected evidence and illustrations of practice, so that rather than just using words to try and describe something, we tried to use a short case to give a little bit of an exemplar of what that would look like in practice. And so the model that we get when we get to our framework is where we have our domain, in this example here, our curriculum design, our standard, which is students and industries are partners in the design of the WIL curriculum, and then an illustration of how that could actually be achieved. So that's sort of where the framework is, and that's where our thinking is that underpins it. But I might hand over to Ricky and Kate now to take us through the conversation around benchmark quality.
Thanks, Matthew. So as Matthew mentioned at the beginning, the benchmarking of the framework was undertaken at both an institution-wide and discipline level. But I'll be focusing on the experience from the Faculty of Health at QUT, and Kate will be able to complement that with her experience at University of Sydney. So my approach to commence with developing a checklist and doing a desktop audit of the available evidence. What I did was I pre-populated the checklist with as much information that I was aware of, and then went to other stakeholders to fill in some of those gaps. It was an aspect that we wanted to test was the accessibility of the evidence. So we came up with categories to be able to denote the evidence, whether it was accessible with some effort, or not accessible at all. It was clear fairly early on that if we wanted the benchmarking exercise to be a worthwhile exercise, we needed to include a range of stakeholders to fill in the gaps and ensure the accuracy of the information. And this for me included unit coordinators, course coordinators, and also the Associate Dean Learning and Teaching. And despite having a centralised team to support Will at the faculty level, there were still many gaps that needed input from others. As we went through the framework, we made commentaries on any areas for improvement or what we considered were significant matters. Once the checklist was completed, the next step really was to agree upon the opportunities for improvement and develop an implementation plan with some agreed timeframes. Okay, so what did we learn? We learned that the checklist was extremely important in guiding the process. It was also important not to be limited by the examples cited in the framework and to think outside of those suggestions. There was a bit of a tendency to move onto the next standard as soon as we ticked off 2 or 3 of the examples that were listed in the framework. So while it was easy to tick off standards, we did need to look at the quality of the evidence. So we came up with some further categories to evaluate the evidence. So exemplary evidence, emerging evidence, and elementary evidence. One of the concerns, I think, when I presented the framework to our Faculty Learning and Teaching Committee and Faculty Academic Board was around additional workload that was going to be involved in using the framework. So really, to overcome any issues of additional workload, we agreed that it would be embedded within some existing review processes, such as accreditation. And I'm fairly confident that the evidence that's produced, at least in the Faculty of Health disciplines, that the evidence that is being produced for accreditation can easily support the quality standards in the framework. The exercise, though, is to identify improvements to the delivery and the experience of Will. It's not about just ticking off a checklist. It's not a test, but I do feel that there was a bit of a sense within some of the disciplines that we trialled it with that they thought that they were being tested and that they somehow might fail that test. So reassuring them that it wasn't something that was going to be a negative experience for them, and ensuring that the whole purpose of the process was really to identify improvements for Will. So to gain a holistic understanding of the quality of Will within a discipline or across the university, it does require input from multiple stakeholders. So I think having a champion to be able to coordinate that review process is really beneficial. And in the Faculty of Health at QUT, that champion is me, and I'm starting to use the framework in real life with our Bachelor of Human Services, which is going through an accreditation process at the moment. So I'll now hand over to Kate, and she can give you the University of Sydney perspective.
Thanks, Ricky. And hi, everyone. Nice to have you here. We have a little bit of a different story, because even though I'm part of a central work integrated learning team, we tend to work within our own disciplines. So for us, when we were focusing on the discipline level, I knew that there was going to be a lot of information and evidence that I had no idea about at all. And so for me, I needed to tread very carefully, because obviously these are the benchmarking process, as Ricky suggested, is something where everyone's very, very keen to sticky beak and have a look at data and sort of what else is happening in other places that they don't normally know about. But no one ever wants a benchmarking exercise to make them look bad. And so the first step for me was then talking with heads of discipline and sending very, very gentle invitations to say, hey, do you want to be part of this thing? We're trialing a tool. We're just kind of having a look here. It's not going to be publicly shared. You might find some great things out. So it was very important at that early stage to kind of get the right people on board and have that be a focus that we'd sort of identified, but they'd sort of identified as well. This was something that we did at the same time. Ricky and Matthew were very kind in creating a spreadsheet that was a single document So it meant that from the beginning we had a bunch of rows and a bunch of columns that different people could be completing as it was passed down the chain. So you weren't kind of having multiple people working with multiple drafts of the same thing. It was quite a good streamlined process. So I think those are probably the big things at the start that I feel like we got right, and that made a process sort of a bit more smooth than it might have otherwise been. Probably the people who are the unit coordinator level, for us, they didn't really care what the purpose of it was. They went, I have that information, here it is. But yeah, the people higher up really wanted to know where this information was going, who was going to see it, and what might be the outcome of that. The framework, as you might have noticed with the small text that Matthew mentioned, is quite large. So I think an initial barrier is just kind of where do you start and how do you get into it? And so that talking to the right people, asking nicely, getting people to start and doing kind of little bit by little bit means that you go, oh, okay, well, actually, we've got this really great evidence. So you start to have that positive experience of almost evaluating it along the way, which, again, that encourages people to do more work. Going a little bit more into details and looking for evidence that wasn't easily accessible, I think was a bit trickier, and is probably one of the good outcomes of a framework like this, in that the way that we're thinking about the quality of will is much deeper and sort of, I think, more meaningful, because you do ask questions that you might not otherwise ask, but you can't ask them unless you have the evidence, and then you can't necessarily find the evidence because only certain people have institutional knowledge, and it's all a bit tricky. So the biggest lesson here was probably be patient and be kind to other people, kind of our standard things that we're doing at the moment anyway, perhaps more than usual. But I think little bit by little bit, as the document got kind of more and more populated, it then became something that was really useful to hand back. So it did perhaps take longer than we would have liked and that we might have anticipated, but it meant that we had more than we perhaps had thought we would, and could go back to those original people and say, hey, here's a thing you might want to use. Yes, it's achieved our purpose. We've had kind of a really go at using a framework, but also you use it now in a way that's meaningful for you. For one of the disciplines, they had started a partnership agreement with QUT, and USyd had actually started a partnership agreement, and it was part of their accreditation that they were going to benchmark with each other. And they'd said this thing that, you know, you would say in an accreditation, we do, you know, have these really good plans. They'd done some, but hadn't actually asked some questions and gathered some evidence. And the cool thing about it is that both of those universities recognised that the other university had some really good things to offer that they weren't doing. So that's kind of your ideal outcome, is that they really wanted to learn from the other person, but they could also do a little bit of self-promotion, which my experience of all the leadership that I've kind of met is they always want to be able to say, oh, we're from others, but also, have you heard this great stuff that we're all about? So I think that was a nice outcome as well, in terms of kind of keeping everyone that sort of saving face, as well as getting something meaningful in terms of improvement, which is what we really want this framework to be able to do. We really want it to be able to ask questions and help people to gather evidence so that you can improve the quality of will in your place. And that's my story. So I think I'm able to hand on to the next person, which
So
might be
Leonie. Yeah, over to you, Leonie. Yeah.
Yep. Yep. It's coming. There we go. Sorry, just had to turn everything back on. Hi, everyone. We've thought about different ways that we can use the framework and how it can impact will right across your institution. So there was quite a few ways that we've used it, and we'll have a quick presentation from Barb Walsh from University of Canberra, and she'll highlight how she's used it. But here's a few very key basic ways that you can use this framework. You can drill right down to looking at the actual will activity at a very insular level and the quality around that particular will practice, and review what it is that you're doing. On a broader scale, this sort of framework helps to create a reflective culture about quality for assuring will. So it has a shared language around it, and that's the good thing. When she starts socialising the framework, people start to use the same language around what constitutes quality will. And we've used it to help inform our professional development activities, how we go about building staff capability and what resources on our websites, what resources for students and for staff. So we use the framework to help inform that. It's also at RMIT being used to help structure the promotion criteria, and it informs position descriptions around some of the key things that we need it right across the board. We've just recently used it, the framework, developing or updating our will procedure, and it's informing the governance processes around program and course review and design, which has been great as well. It also underpins the opportunity to look at how we do scholarship learning and teaching, and informs the sorts of research that we can do. It's informing, you know, awards at RMIT. So what are our will awards, or our learning and teaching awards, and how we try to encourage more and more people to get into research and scholarship in this space. And as Ricky and Kate have just mentioned, it's a really good tool to help you do some benchmarking within a discipline, across your practices, across the school, across a whole discipline and across institutions. So it's a great tool to be able to sit back and have a think about what you do, try and find the evidence of what you do, and it's helped us identify great practice that when we can share and promote, as Kate said, everybody loves to hear a good story when we've ticked off a lot of the criteria and the standards, and we're finding evidence of fantastic will that's going on. Now, Barb, are you there? Because I'm going to hand over to you, because you've actually been doing it, the University of Canberra.
Okay. Can you hear
Hi,
me?
Barb. Can we hear you?
Yes, yes. Well, okay. Am I up?
Barb, you're just a bit quiet.
I'm just a bit quiet. Of course I am. Okay. I'm going to have to put myself back on my laptop.
There we go.
Rightio. Is that better?
That's much better.
Excellent.
Okay. Of course, sorry, I have to keep on changing between my screens. Okay, so we have, can everyone still hear me?
Yes.
Good. So we haven't really, I guess we've developed this, but we haven't yet started to kind of roll it out. It's a little bit small there on the screen for everyone, so I hope that you can see it. Essentially, what we have in the faculty is 4 units of kind of professional practice curricula, 2 units of which are will. So that's a 1/6 of every student's degree, essentially. So we looked at using this framework as a basis of evaluating the quality of our will across the domains. And I guess I looked at Teresa Winchester-Cito's work to develop this kind of model, and also there was a BLAST report by Marina Harvey that kind of laid out a kind of a benchmarking tool that I also poached from. So I guess what we've done is mapped what we would like to see as good practice and minimum standard in our will across the faculty, across the domains, and have then added on, okay, so we might have we might have good practice in one area in student experience, for example, but how do we know that actually is having some sort of an outcome that results in something? So we've added in, I guess, the impact indicators and the kind of evaluative measures that we want to deliver. So I'm just trying to have a look at that there. So, for example, if we say that students, the first standard in the student experience domain is that students understand the purpose of the experience, etc. So we've identified what ideally we want as good practice and what we can just get away with as a minimum standard. What sources of evidence do we look at to ensure that or to evaluate that quality dimension, and then what impact indicators. So what do we want students to feel or to know or whatever, and then how do we know that? So that will help inform then our student check-in, check-up and check-out surveys, industry check-in, check-up and check-out surveys. So it's I guess it's an ambitious framework, but we've just got quite a big program, I guess. And so for us, the quality dimensions are a fantastic kind of scaffold to hang all of this stuff off, for us to identify and examine the evidence for ensuring a quality program, but then to hang off that the indicators for the outcomes of that quality program, if that makes sense. So it's quite big, it's quite unwieldy, but at the end of the day, we've got it all outlined there about what we now need to go through to check off, to see what areas we're strong in, what areas where we need to develop. So for example, we know from looking at this that we really need to do a lot more work in the stakeholder and partner engagement. We've also tweaked some of the standards just to suit us, I guess. So just to make sure that they make sense for our faculty.
That's great. Thanks, Barb.
No problem.
I'm glad you've used it. It's fantastic. All right, I'll hand back to you, Matthew.
Thanks, Leonie, and thanks, Barb. And it is great to see it in practice, and in particular challenging, as Ricky's identified and as Barb has realised. Whilst we've got standards and we've got some indicative practices, there still does remain this question around sort of what evidence are you looking for and what standard of evidence they're looking for. In other words, is it enough just to have an evaluation survey, or is there particular characteristics of that survey that you'd want to see play out? So it is great to see it being extended in that direction. So that then leads us to an opportunity that we'll have to start to think about the framework in action, and this will test whether or not you did your homework, particularly following up the email from Erin where she shared the framework. What we want to try and do now is to break ourselves up into some smaller groups just to allow a little bit of conversation. I have put into the chat, we won't have a lot of time for Q&A at the end, but if you've got any particular questions, please drop it into the chat and we'll try and respond to it as we go along. But what we want to try and do now is to break it into small groups. So I'm going to ask you to focus on 2 questions, and it's probably the second one is more important. We won't have a lot of time to do this. But the idea here is to ask the question around how relevant is this framework in your context? How relevant is the conversation of quality assurance of will in your context? And then the second question is, what resourcing and support would you need in order to be able to better manage quality assurance of will and to employ such a framework and to challenge some of those questions around sort of the level of quality that you see play out. So we're going to try and do this now. We'll break up into some small groups and allow some conversations in that depth. Each group will be facilitated by one of the project members, so you can ask some questions and have some conversations there. We'll give you 15 minutes, and then we're going to come back together and share some of those thoughts that come out of that and wrap up where we're at. So, Erin, I trust that you're about to throw us out into the wilderness.
I'm about to press the magic button and everyone will disappear into your groups. Feel free, if something goes wrong, just to chat to me on the chat function. So thank you.
Oh,
Hang on.
I think we've been brought back.
We are. Oh, and we were sorry, Simon, you were mid-sentence. Bang.
Yeah, we were mid-sentence too.
We're all mid-sentence. We didn't get like a 1 minute warning. It was sort of, okay, wrap things up and then all right, gone.
Bang.
That time went so quickly.
I bet you it did. I bet you it did. It's not like Zoom, and I can't give a countdown. I'll try and find out how to do that. I'm sure moving forward. Okay. But I believe Lorraine and Matthew. Over to you guys.
Yeah, I'll answer Lorraine. Thanks. Yeah.
Okay, thanks everyone. Yeah, well, gosh, that time went so quickly. So what we have is we have 10 minutes to get some feedback from each of the moderators, and I've actually got myself a timer here, and so I'm going to start and time myself because I might as well kick off with a little bit of feedback. So we've got 2 minutes each. I don't think I'm going to need the 2 minutes, but we had a really interesting discussion. I think one of the things that really struck me was the range of discipline areas of the people in my breakout room. So we have people from occupational therapy, a range of health professions in rural areas, engineering, IT, accounting, HDR students, all disciplines. So, and there were some other people in our group who didn't get a chance to say what discipline area they're from. But this is really encouraging and exciting, I think, to see the level of interest across so many different disciplines. And the feedback I got was basically that this is a really interesting and exciting looking framework that resonates with some of the people in the room that I was in, and that one of the strengths is its co-design, and that the plan for some of our people in my breakout room is to start trialling it, but maybe the best way to do that is in small steps, so not to try and roll it out across the board, but just to take little steps, and to I'm just reading my notes here, and to get some feedback from stakeholders. One of the people in my breakout room, they're actually having a roundtable panel at a conference in October, and they wanted to have a look at the guiding principles and get some feedback from that roundtable. So, I have taken 2 minutes, so I should stop now, and I'll pass on to the next person. So who would like to go next?
I think Kate, did you want to share what came out of your group?
Okay, sure thing. I can do that. So I think probably the first thing is I need to apologise for not encouraging my group to introduce themselves. So I've really let us down as group one there. Sorry about that, guys. But despite that, I feel like we still had a good chat. A really good point from Hugh is that he sees the potential for the framework to actually build quality assurance into curriculum design from the beginning, because that's the point that he's at. So I think that was really good that a framework is something that can be used not just for things that are already in place that can actually inform design. A question was around sort of a central team versus small scale and how we might think about using it in different ways for different people depending on resources and depending on how much time I have. I think Philip's answers questions around how meaningful WIL can actually be preparing students for future learning and future experiences beyond university, beyond kind of their initial workplace experiences, and how the framework relates to that. So some questions that I'm now starting to ask, as well as some future thoughts there. That's probably the big things from our group, I'd say, and happy to hand over to the next person.
So maybe if we want to jump over to Ricky.
Thanks, Matthew. So our group, some interesting conversations around not so much about implementing the actual framework to do a quality assurance review, but actually using the framework to be able to develop some of the resources. So RMIT talked about redesigning their WIL website and arranging the information around the 4 domains. And also we talked about developing some guidelines and so it was almost like the framework was going to produce some of the resources which would in turn also support the standards. We also talked a little bit about the involvement in the framework and the benchmarking exercises, and talked about how it could be a light touch, where using it as a bit of a checklist, or it could be a full-on review as part of accreditation processes. So I think the most interesting bit was how the framework was leading to other resources to support quality assurance. So I'll hand it over to the next group now.
Thanks, Ricky. I think that's Leonie, I think would be the next one.
That'd be me. Yep. Some great ideas about how people are using it. I think Wayne in my group, talking about how the framework, certain sections of it, obviously not all of it, is helping them at Deakin to help structure the will. So it's a really good, useful tool, and other people have said this as well, to help when you actually start designing and implementing your will. So it gives you that sort of framework around that. And we have Barb in our group talking a little bit, a couple of people about that the framework's useful and that you can contextualise the standards to suit your own region or what you need. So then it can help inform a shared language that you need to help sort out the quality. I think the other thing, which a little bit, it helps raise the profile of the discussion around quality, which is what we're trying to get to as well. So different people have used it to help structure their will. It's useful to help set goals and targets for what you're trying to achieve. And again, just at the end, before we got cut off, we're talking about as others have mentioned, that centralisation and decentralisation of resources and support to be able to use the framework, to do the benchmarking, to do support program teams in designing curriculum and quality will. So I think we're always going to have a struggle with trying to find the resources that we need, but it's about looking beyond your own little area and reaching out. So there's some of the key things. Others have already been covered by the other groups.
Thanks, Leonie.
And I'm sure Group 2 will put something into the chat if I've missed it.
Yes, thanks, Leonie. That leaves myself and my group. We're quite fortunate. We had quite a small group, and a shout out to those in there. We got cut off just right when Peter from UWA was sharing some really interesting thoughts, where I wrote a comment down around the importance of getting it right at the beginning, and the idea that laying the groundwork of what is a quality practice at the foundation of the design of an activity is really important, and having it work throughout. And Greg spoke a little bit to the idea that what the framework allows us to do, and I put this in my own words, so I apologise, but it's making the invisible work of will visible. It gives us a language to talk about what it is that we do, and to give some credit and credence to those activities that often go unseen by many other people. I think, as I crudely put it in our group, we often think that people just get put onto a placement on Monday and everything's all rosy. We miss all of that activity that wraps around the outside of that this gives us a language to talk about. And lastly, a shout to Kim, who we're looking forward to actually seeing the outcome of her own thesis and research around quality. But she did talk about and raise the idea of the need to have different perspectives on what quality is. And so I think one of the opportunities, if anybody wants to push forward with it, is actually looking at the different perspectives on how this framework is understood and applied. It's been written very much from a will practitioner, will academic perspective. It's been written for the use of will practitioners and will academics, but it would be interesting to consider the perspectives of students in understanding what quality and will is, and the perspective from industry in that regard. So there is opportunity in that space to actually think about how those things could better be integrated into a broader understanding of quality in that space. So, Lorraine, did you have any other further comments to make?
Just one further comment, Matthew, before you wrap up. And I was just sort of making some notes about the feedback from each of the moderators. And one thing that struck me is the future-oriented applications of this framework and its value. So not just in the assessing quality assurance in will, but also its future applications. So using case studies to show how it can be used elsewhere, raising the profile of discussion about quality and helps us to set goals and targets. So I think that's a really exciting aspect of this framework.
Well, thanks, Lorraine. And I've just seen the time. We're right on target. I was very strict, everybody. We had to hit our time targets, and even the ending of the small groups was brutal, but it was on time. So that's what happens in these sessions. But it's just about to click over to 1:30, which was the time that we said we'd finish. So I want to wrap up now, just by saying thank you to everybody that's been online today and allowed us the opportunity to talk about the framework, but also to prioritise the conversation around quality and discussions around what quality will look like, how we can evidence it and how we can articulate it. So I'm hoping that this is the start of a conversation, and we as a project team are very welcome to anybody taking the framework, using it first and foremost, and please let us know, but also taking the framework and reconceptualising it and utilising it in different ways. And as I said, I think thinking about the different perspectives, some of the weaknesses that we found in our study was that we're very Australian-centric. There's an opportunity for us to look more broadly in the global scale, but also we're being contextualised within higher education. So there's questions to be asked around what's the relationship between this experience and the vocational experience, etc. So a big thank you. The website is there. Please jump onto the website. And if you've got any other questions or you want to have further conversations, please email anybody from the group. We're more than willing to reach out and help anybody in any way they can. So thanks very much, everybody. And Erin, did you need to wrap up anything, or we're good?
No, just to echo your comments there. Thank you to everyone for taking the time out. I am going to stop recording.